So I guess we'll get started, 5:30. Everybody, thanks for coming timely and with your mask and appropriate IDs. We appreciate that. I'm David Mackey, for those who I haven't met yet, please make sure we do. I'm the proud new owner, relatively new owner of the Philadelphia Print Shop. And many people know was in Chestnut Hill for 38 years. They closed 2 years ago at Christmas time, and I heard about that shortly thereafter, and went up there and saw the building was for sale, but I wasn't interested in the building, just the business. And it took a little while, and about 6 months, and was able to complete the acquisition, so to speak, and we moved to Wayne, the back of the old State Store down the street, October a year ago. What I want to tell you, though, is that during that time, during that 6-month process, my neighbor called me, asked me about who replaced my windows in our townhouse development. And that gentleman is named Justin Martino, who's here tonight. And the reason I mentioned him is that conversation led to, what have you been up to, what have you been doing? I said, I'm buying this map business. He said, oh my God, you've got to meet this guy. Have you ever heard of? You got to meet this guy, John F. Smith III. I'm like, I've never heard of him. So I started it didn't take me long. I found him, right? And then I think Justin gave me his email, and I think I might have waited a day or two, and then I wrote an email and I talked about my background and my passion for maps and antique maps of this area, and said that I look forward to meeting him. I wanted to learn about his passion, his collection, and so, as you might imagine, for those who know John, he got back to me almost right away. I would say within a day or two, and it was the most, thoughtful and well-wishing type of email that you would expect from this gentleman. So during that dialogue that we had online first for a little while, even in the first email, I think he said, when this COVID thing is over, and it had just started 2 summers ago, he goes, or sometime down the road, we'll have you over for a cocktail and we'll talk about maps on the big porch. And we'll also go sometime to Picot Hall at Villanova, where I have this permanent display of some of my key maps that I've donated to Villanova. So that took a year because of the COVID thing, but we finally had the cocktail this past fall. John did come the first day we opened in October a year ago to the store to wish us well, and then we finally had the cocktail this past September with Susan pouring, and that was just fine. Ended up having 2.
He's saying a heavy pour.
So we had a great gin and tonic, let's say, and a good conversation about maps. And we started to talk about what we could do to showcase his collection. Some of you may know, John over the last 2-3 years has donated a couple hundred maps to Villanova, about 140 of which have been digitized and are in the digital Falvey Memorial Library. And he has another, I'll call them the top 40, serious, individual maps that are on permanent display?
Yes.
Semi-permanent display at Picot Hall. So Jennifer Beacom, where's Jennifer? From the Radnor Historical Society, who's co-sponsoring this little event, by the way, and has been gracious to the Philadelphia Print Shop since we came here a year and a half ago. We did a couple of Zoom calls for them. So Jennifer and I, after the cocktails that I had with these guys, we went to a private tour, if you will, with John at Picot Hall on the west end of the Villanova campus. And after we took all that in and sat down for a bit, we came up with this notion of what could we do. And I don't know if it was at that particular moment, but I said, why don't we have a talk, it's like a speaker series. And John could be our first speaker. So tonight, John will be first of what we hope will be several and more talks with folks like John Smith and another couple of folks who are interested in prints and maps and who want to share their collection and their passion. So it's really for Justin reaching out to me about the windows in the townhouse development that told me about John Smith that caused us all to be here this evening. So I had to point him out to make sure that Justin has since become a friend, as John has as well. And we done a couple things together. We've shared some stories and some books, and talked about how we could further showcase his distinguished collection of Villanova, and there may be more than just this series coming out, and we just thought it would be a great chance for John to come in and talk about his maps, to invite people that he knows, to include people from Radnor Historical, and to welcome you to our new place. As I said, we've been here a year and a half. We have about 2,000 square feet here. We've moved twice during COVID, but we don't plan to move anymore. We plan to be here for a while, and believe me, it wasn't easy to move this once, let alone twice. So before I introduce John a little further, I just want to say thank you again to Jennifer Beacom from the Radnor Historical Society, and those who were with Radnor Historical continue to be good sponsors and good supporters of us and what we're trying to do here, bring new people in and to share the prints and the history of the area. So next I'd just like to introduce my colleague Jane Toczek. It's tough to say, but if you say Jane, you'll get it right. And Jane has been with the Philadelphia Print Shop for 28 or so.
Well, there were 25 plus before, and then almost 2 now.
So she's been with the Philadelphia Print Shop for, say, 27 or 8 years. Her colleague Quincy, who I was also fortunate enough to find, who's not here tonight, he couldn't be here, but he's been with the Philadelphia Print Shop over 30 years. So while the shop will be 40 years old this year, together they've been here almost 60 years.
Wow.
So I learned from
really old.
So they really are experts. I'm more of a map enthusiast and promoter, and they're really experts in prints and maps, and can tell what's real and what's not very quickly. So without them, this place wouldn't survive. And with your help, we think we can, and we will. And I want to also thank Pam Sador from Radnor Library, who was able to, let's say, borrow these chairs from the library next door. Fairly under the radar kind of way.
One chair.
Yeah, right. And by the way, we like them, so we're probably just going to keep them, right? And like you said, she'll never know. Right?
That's right.
And I want to thank Lisa Delaney. Lisa does our social media. She might take a few pictures of you tonight. And does our Facebook and Instagram stuff.
Follow us.
Yeah, and we have a new website. We're trying to do those things and get other people, to see our place, and just, most people don't know that we're here, or some people don't know, or that all of this is here. And then last, I'd like to thank Leslie, my high school friend and colleague, who is working the lights tonight for John, and often helps us out at these little events. So for those who don't know much about John, although I'm sure most of you know a lot about John, John served in the U.S. Navy. He attended Princeton and Yale Law School. Is that right? He was recruited to Philadelphia by the law firm of Dilworth Paxton after Yale. He is of counsel now to the large international law firm of Reed Smith, where he spent a number of years, and probably, I think, still runs or organized the Reed Smith University.
I did.
Right. And so in his spare time over the last 10 or 15 years, he was also the chairman emeritus and senior counselor to the Global Philadelphia Association, which is an association of 140 organizations and or individual members promoting Philadelphia, such that I believe he was largely responsible for helping the city of Philadelphia attain World Heritage status in 2013. Expanding the region and its global reach. Of counsel, like I said, with Reed Smith, a big international law firm. But above all, as you probably know, he's a gentleman, he's a scholar, he's a leader among leaders, and he's now my new map mentor. So with that, I turn it over to John.
All right, well, thank you, David. It's obvious that anything I say at this moment will be less than the build-up you've already given me, so I probably should sit right down. I do want to thank you, though, for hosting this event. It took quite a bit of effort, and we've moved everything around. It's going to completely discombobulate your business for the next week or so.
All right.
And I want to thank Jennifer, who has been a wonderful partner in the Radnor Historical Society. Thank you for all you do and all of the members that are here tonight. It's particularly nice of you to invite a failed backpacker to come and speak to you. That's how the whole enterprise began. I was active as a camper, and then a hiker, and then a backpacker, and I fell in love first with those ratty, sweaty maps that backpackers carry with them, with all the topographic lines, and it was just fascinating to me, fascinating. Orienteering was fascinating to me. And this book, of course, was before we had our iPhones. There's no excuse for getting lost today, is there? And I'm going to guess that the last time you looked at a map, it was on the little screen, right? You probably said, well, where the heck is the Philadelphia print shop? Oh, there it is. And there were the directions. You don't have to look at a piece of paper anymore, ever. Well, I hope that's not the case, because what we're going to talk about today is an old-fashioned medium, but a medium that is absolutely spectacular, and which I think has the power to captivate you if you get engaged with it. So after those topographic maps, the next 30 to 40 years have been spent kind of elevating my game. And one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. Susan and I have been to many places in the course of our traveling lives, and we have bought maps in Mumbai, in Bangkok, in London, in Germany. One of the nice things about map collecting for me is that it's associated with marvelous trips. And I encourage you to think about it that way yourself. Many of you have traveled, many of you have affectionate relations with different parts of the world. It might be a nice thing for you to collect in a fashion print map. It's a wonderful souvenir. So I encourage you to think about maps as something that you too might collect. Now the good news is, you already own one of the most famous and important maps in the world. And I'm going to show you a picture of it later. But it was made in 1507 by a guy named Martin Waldseemüller. And Waldseemüller was one of the esteemed map makers of the day. He was also a friend of a guy named Amerigo Vespucci. And as many of you know, Vespucci didn't get to the Americas first, but he got to the Americas in a very significant way. He explored some of the South American coast that Columbus never saw. Anyway, in 1507, trying to figure out what name to apply to this little corner of the earth, Waldseemüller said, I'm going to name it after my friend Amerigo Vespucci, who, by the way, was a pretty good self-promoter, and so he was kind of aiming for this to happen. And in a little bit, we're going to show you a slide where the word America, A-M-E-R-I-C-A, appears for the very first time. And you bought it. Or more accurately, the Library of Congress bought it. Or more accurately, the Library of Congress plus a lot of very beneficent people bought it. And so $10 million was anteed up. And if you do the math, $10 million, 7 letters, A-M-E-R-I-C, it's about $1,450,000 per letter. It's a bargain. And it was the only map it's the only surviving map of about 1,200 that were originally printed. So I say that not just because you own it and you can go down to the Library of Congress and actually see it, because you got a head start. You already own something. So go find something that's fun for you and collect them. Now, in the course of this discussion, I'm going to be joined by David's and my colleague, Jane Toczek. I actually know Jane longer than I've known David. Because some of these maps I purchased from the Philadelphia print shop when it was still over in Chestnut Hill. I think I ought to start, though, by just a little bit of history about map making as it grew up in the western part of the globe. Now, there were early maps. Ur and other communities in the Mesopotamia region. There are little shards of ceramics that arguably represent the community, the world, what have you, and that goes back many, many, many years. However, what I'd like to do is to focus for the moment on the Greeks. Everything begins with the Greeks, right? And talk a little bit about how the Greeks regarded the earth and how map making kind of grew out of that. Many of you, of course, are familiar with the Odyssey and the Iliad. The Homeric world was a world where the earth was basically a disk, a platter. It did not have a third dimension. And that was a body of thought that governed in Greece for hundreds of years. But as time came along, people like Aristotle began to say, well, no, there's a more perfect shape, more perfect solid than a disk. It's called a sphere. And from that very theoretical framework, began to think about the world as a globe. And of course, it stood the test of time. People would actually see things going over the horizon, and yes, it made sense that this was really a sphere. Along comes a guy named Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes was a mathematician and an astronomer, and he did a remarkable calculation that involved the sun's rays, a well, an angular difference, and he calculated the circumference of the Earth at the very early stage. This is before the year zero. And Eratosthenes calculated the world, and if you translate the units he was working with, he calculated that the Earth was 26,000 miles in circumference. Pretty damn close. The actual number is more like somewhere in the 25,000 range, and it varies. But people like Eratosthenes and other Greeks applied their reason, their astronomical skills, and began to really come closer and closer to what the nature of the beast is that we all live on. Fast forward a couple of hundred years to the period between 880 and 150, and that was a year when the great library at Alexandria in Egypt was going strong. The scholars there were among the most important in the world, and one of them was a guy named Claudius Ptolemy. Ptolemy was a Greek, and Ptolemy, through his inquiring mind and having correspondence all across the then known part of the world, began to accumulate coordinates. They weren't quite exactly the latitude and longitude that we think of today, but pretty darn close. And Ptolemy began to accumulate the positions of this and that city and that other city and so on, and accumulated well over a couple of thousand of points marked by latitude and longitude. It's not completely clear whether he made a map, although he could well have made a map. But then something terrible happened, and that is the library became less important, the Roman Republic became less viable, Rome began to disintegrate, Alexandria and the library began to disintegrate, and a lot of that early work that was done by the Greeks just got lost in the shuffle. Well, not quite, because over here there were scholars in Islam that were paying attention. And a lot of the early work that the Greeks did was picked up and carried forward, very importantly, by scholars in the world of Islam. And it's a good thing because Europe was about to go into a very dark and benighted period, the so-called Dark Ages. And during that period, they had forgotten all about the Greeks. They had forgotten all about Ptolemy. And instead, religious fervor took over in terms of map making. So that the typical map in that period of time was sometimes referred to as a TO map. What's a TO map? TO map, if you can imagine it, has a bar. Imagine the capital letter T on its side. There's a bar here, a bar here, and around it is a big circle. And for the religiously inclined, that was all there was that needed to be paid attention to, because Jerusalem was here in the east, and that's what everybody needed to be focused on. So you had the Mediterranean as the horizontal bar. You had the River Don heading up toward the Black Sea, going up north. You had the Nile going south, that formed the T, and Jerusalem was right at the head of the T. And that was all that was important. And if you were a pilgrim, all you needed to know was you needed to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And a TO map, a little bit more elaborate than I've described, would get you there. So what happened to poor old Ptolemy? Well, the Islamic scholars were working away, and the science, the astronomy was being built up there. In the meantime, the most realistic maps that were being developed in the area of the Mediterranean were called portolan maps. And what's a portolan map? A portolan map was used by a seafaring navigator in the Med, and you really didn't need to know a whole lot about world geography. You just needed to know what the landmarks were along the shoreline and what the next community was and how to get from A to B. And so a very popular instrument in that period of time was a sheepskin that had a rough outline of the coastline that you and your traders were frequenting. So the portolan map was the most accurate thing that the Europeans had for quite a while. But slowly but surely, the influence of Ptolemy came back. And the Europeans rediscovered this remarkable notion that there's a larger world and that you could actually pinpoint and navigate from one part to the rest. So we're going to take a little bit of an excursion to see that. One of the things that also prompted this was in 1453, very important date, 1453, the Turks conquered Constantinople. That was big because up until that time, there was a fairly flourishing trade in spices and other kinds of goods between the Europeans and Central Asians and even the Chinese. And a flow of spices, the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, actually were making their way all the way across to Europe. And Europe took quite a fancy to them. Boom, Constantinople falls to the Turks, and that route is closed off. And that was not a happy thing. And that was one of many inducements that led people like Prince Henry of Portugal to encourage navigation, and the Portuguese particularly began to explore down the African coast. A couple of them actually made it all the way around below. Some later they got as far as Goa in India. And Europe had reconnected in a fashion with its far eastern supply. That was a heck of a long distance. There must be a better way. There must be a better way. And of course, enter Columbus and others who said, well, you know, I think just by sailing west, not east, west, I can get to the Indies, I can get my hands on those spices, and off he went. With great courage and great cruelty. I mean, Columbus is not anybody that you'd like to have as a next-door neighbor. But he did a remarkable thing. And I think that with that, what I might suggest is that we turn the lights off. I'm going to try to get this projector to do the thing that I want it to do. Okay, can you see this? All right, good. How to get it is. Here we go. Okay. Ah. Here's the
First
map that you
thing, I should
want.
just say, John did all this himself, right? All this.
Yes, he did, I can swear by it.
Just wanted to give credit where credit's due.
All right.
Thank you.
You're not helping my relationship. All right, so I mentioned Martin Waldseemüller. I mentioned the fact that he created a map and that he employed the word America in honor of his friend, Amerigo Vespucci. And this is it. It's in 12 different sections. I'm sorry that the fidelity is not a little better, but you can see that it comprehends the entire world. It's a remarkable achievement. Africa there is in full. The Indian Ocean is the Indian Ocean. And lo and behold, here are the Americas. These are the West Indies. This is, believe it or not, North America. Not too much of North America. There's a bit of the Florida Peninsula sticking down. But in the minds of Waldseemüller, South America was really where it was at. And so let's take a closer look at there down in the lower left-hand corner of his 12 segmented map is South America, and down below are the magic letters A-M-E-R-I-C-A. And so, can you see that? I'm sorry.
I can move back and forth, I can catch it.
All right.
No, move all the way
So
back.
that was the beginning of the use of the term. Now, a few years later, Waldseemüller had a change of mind. He said, oh, God, I overestimated what this species did. It was really Columbus. I made a big mistake. This new set of continents probably should be named after Christopher Columbus. Too late. He was such a prominent map maker that others followed suit. And the word America was indelibly imprinted on first South America and then later North America. So America stuck, even though Waldseemüller had a change of heart. Okay, now, I hope that you'll have a chance, when we're through, to take a look at the real thing. This is a map that a guy named Lawrence Fries did using the Ptolemaic coordinates. So I can't tell you that this map was done in the year 150. It was done in the year roughly 1540, more or less. And it is a way of representing all of those data points that Ptolemy had come up with. And it's a classic of the day. It's the Ptolemaic version. Even though the Americas had already been discovered, Ptolemy was so powerful as a force that maps just using his coordinates and just ending. You see, here's Spain, here's Africa. Off here in a little sprinkle are something called the Fortunate Islands. Have you heard about the Fortunate Isles? Fortunate Isles were mythical isles in Greek lore. They were the place where some of the Greek heroes, their spirits, went there after they died. And so to go to the Fortunate Isles was to be blessed enough to be put into this wonderful post-living status. Well, of course, there are real islands there. The Canaries are there, the Azores are there. And so the Fortunate Isles actually have a little bit of a predicate. But this is a wonderful map following the Ptolemaic tradition. Another tradition that's being followed here is a Roman tradition of the wind heads. Most people today think about the wind heads as maybe 4 cardinal points or 8 cardinal points. The Romans used 12. And so each one of these blowhards has a name, and the name of the wind that you experience is given to the figure. So it's a wonderful, it's a beautiful map, and again, it captures what was then known, the then known world. The Greek's term for that, by the way, was the oikoumene. Oikoumene. Oikoumene means the known world, the entire known world, and that's where the word that we use, ecumenical, comes from. So, which is all comprehending. So anyway, that's Lawrence Freese interpreting Ptolemy. Now we're going to take another step forward and talk a little bit about beautiful maps and misconceptions of the day. This is a map by Abraham Ortelius. I don't know if you've heard of Ortelius. Ortelius is thought to be the maker of the first atlas, which basically meant that he collected maps made by various map makers, brought them together in a single volume, all sized roughly the same, and giving credit, which many other compilers of maps did not do in that day and age. He actually gave credit to the people whose maps he used. And this map, which dates to 1570, is a map of the Americas, and it's a wonderful conception. You can already see that Brazil is separate from the rest of South America. You can see the North American continent is much wider than is expected it is in fact. Not too much interior detail. It's still just 1570, and the explorations are still a long time away. One interesting thing to keep in mind is, here's California. And Ortelius gets it right. California is there as a peninsula. So just keep that in mind. Now, what is this thing? Well, it's much bigger than any continent that we know of, Antarctica, despite all of that. And it's huge. And why is it so big? Well, one of the reasons is that early map makers and early geographers thought that the world needed to be balanced. They were quite aware of the continents to the north and the middle, but how was the Earth going to maintain its uprightness unless there was a solid bottom at the bottom? So here you have a very exaggerated and not very well articulated Antarctica, not called as such, it was just the unknown continent. Anyway, Ortelius is just one of the most beautiful map makers, and in the course of the next 100 years, the Flemish and the Dutch dominated map making, and their maps were exquisitely beautiful. That's Abraham Ortelius. Now, we're going to come back to this map when Jane and I talk a little bit about the anatomy of maps. But this is a series of what are called gores. Each of these slices, you might recognize them as the kind of thing that can be pasted on a sphere and turned into a globe. But I mention it here for another reason, which is right there. That's California again, but in the conception of Heinrich Scherer, who made this map, California is an island. It turned out that in 1625, a mapmaker named Henry Briggs thought that it was an island. He had enough prestige, those who followed suit. And for the next 100 years, California was an island. And there are people who do nothing but collect California as island maps. That's their thing. And California remained an island until about 100 years later, when a Franciscan monk, Father Kino, said, well, I'm not sure whether it's an island or not. I'm just going to take a walk west and see what happens. And he did. He left a mission in the solid part of California, kept walking, didn't get his feet wet, and he got to the Pacific. So the myth was broken as a result of Father Kino's trek. But for over 100 years, California remained just that way as an island. All right, I think at this point, I'm going to suggest that we turn the lights back on. Jane and I have some stuff to talk about together.
Lights? Bingo.
Okay, well done. Well done. Jane.
Yes.
Jane is so incredibly knowledgeable. And when I used to buy maps at the print shop, they almost always were accompanied by a learned writing describing who did the map, its origin, and a lot of those were done by you, right?
By no means all of them.
But let's talk about the physical qualities of maps. What were they made of and why?
Right.
Well, I mean,
Example.
there probably were manuscript maps that were on vellum or sheepskin, goatskin, some kind of skin. But those, of course, they would all be handmade, and most people couldn't afford those. So when paper was developed, and for those of you who have this, if you hold it up to the light, you'll see there are very faint lines in the paper. This is not laid paper, but it pretends to be laid paper. And that was the way paper was made for a long time. It was made from linen and cotton rags. And if you've been to Williamsburg or other places that show how paper is made, they lay it down on a screen. And the screen, or the chain screen, make these lines in the paper. And so this was the only way to make paper on which the maps were published, and either sold individually or bound into books, like the atlas that John was talking about from Ortelius. And so that was how they made paper up through our revolution. And then right around the turn of the 19th century, some anonymous, as far as I know, person figured out that they could make paper out of wood pulp. So it made paper cheaper, but cotton and linen rags don't have acid in them. So when we have clients come in and they look at the 19th century maps, and then I've actually had people say this, they'll look at an 18th century map and say, no, that doesn't look old enough. I want the one from 1850 because it's nice and brown. It looks old. Well, that's because in 1750 or 1650, they were using much better paper. And so it doesn't turn brown unless it lives in an acidic environment, like between two slats of wood. A lot of framing, especially in the 19th century, was done with wood slats on the back of it. So you get these beautiful stains from the wood. So where the wood slats came together and the air would circulate. So, alas. Anyway, So that's the second, the newer kind of paper was called wove paper and has a completely different texture than this. And then of course there's newsprint, which we all know lasts so long. You know, you put it, leave it out in the sun for a couple of days and it looks awful. So we've made progress, maybe, but we also now know that the best paper to use and the best mat board to use when you frame a piece of paper or work of art on paper is to use cotton rag mat board, which doesn't turn yellow and look like old newsprint on the bevel. So if you're looking at something that's in a frame and you don't know what kind of mat board it has, look at the bevel. If it's turned brown, it's not good news. But anyway, I digress. So there you go. That's way more about paper than you ever wanted to know. Okay, I'm gonna give it back to John now.
Well, okay. We also, I think, can be talking about things about printing. How was printing done? The earliest maps that we have were woodcuts. So you carved out the parts that you didn't want to print. You put ink on the raised portions, stamped it on the paper, and lo and behold, you had a woodcut. But then, in due course, engraving came along, which was really quite the opposite. You had copper plate, you scored it with a sharp instrument, and then put ink on the top, wiped the ink off, leaving the ink in the gouges, put the paper down, and now you had a beautiful fine line caused by the ink that was in the groove. So, engraving made for a much sharper and to many eyes more beautiful image. And then we could get into lithography and other things like that. But I think, Jane, why don't we talk about some of the inks that were used?
Yeah. But the inks are inks, other than iron, I'll talk about iron gall ink and then John gets it back. Iron gall ink was, it was made with rust. So it made a nice dark mark, but the rust ultimately, over time, eats through the paper and you end up with the negative of whatever the manuscript was. So, oops, but did they know this then? No. So we have the benefit of knowing that this was not so good. And the green pigment. You want to talk about verdigris?
Well, sure. Verdigris was a very popular color. It was a lovely, lovely green. And it became the go-to way to produce a green color. But verdigris also had an unhappy habit of turning black and eating the paper up over the next century. And so I have had maps which have all sorts of beautiful features, and then black spaces where the verdigris has done its dirty work. So beware the inks that you use. Well, let me tell another story about ink, and it's going to take us on a mystery tour. I think I've got a copy here, and hopefully you have a chance to maybe briefly see it. This is something I'd like you to take a closer look at. I have a slide of it so we can see it in a little bit. This wonderful, wonderful map showed up for the first time in 1957. It was found by a rare book dealer who had a friend somewhere in Eastern Europe who said, I don't know what to do with this, but I thought it would be interesting. Would you like to buy it? Well, Lawrence Whitten II said, yeah, I sure would like to buy it, and paid him $3,500 to get it. And then Whitten, who was an alumnus of Yale University, got together with another friend or two and said, you know, this is actually too special. It is it looks to me like it's an early map of Europe, yes. Let's turn here. If you look at it closely, you'll see when you come closer. Here is Spain, yes. It looks like the British Isles here. Iceland here. Greenland here. And then something called Vinlandia Insula. Vinlandia Insula, what could that be? Well, after a great deal of scholarship, the original experts, including a guy named R.A. Skelton, who was the map curator of the British Museum, and a couple of guys from the map section of Yale University, the famous collection, concluded that this was an early map made by the Norse and reflected the fact that a portion, at least, of North America had been discovered by Leif Erikson and company back many, many, many years ago in the early 1000 vicinity. And they were so sure of themselves that they published a book,
A big book.
The Vinland Map and the Tartar Revolution. It was conjoined in one of its early manifestations with a description of the Tartars of Central Asia. Well, the scholars had quite a time with this, but here it was being vouched for, with only a little bit of fingers being crossed, being vouched for by three of the most important scholars in the field. Problem: there were wormholes in the map, but the wormholes didn't match up with the Tartar history that it was supposedly part of. So the scholars all of a sudden began to say, well, okay, maybe this is a fake. And then somebody found another item that looked like it probably was part of the original binding, and the wormholes matched up perfectly. The Vinland map is back in respectability. However, there were other indications that were there problems, and scholars went berserk over this stuff. Instead of ending some words with the letter A, the words ended with AE, which was a popular thing, but not until 1700. So why was that AE form being used by a map that purported to be as old as this? Well, finally Yale said, okay, we better have this thing analyzed. And they sent it off to a guy named Macrone, who was an analyst of old things, inks and what have you. And they actually produced, the Macrone people produced a chemical analytical study of the Vinland map. People were really going into depth on this stuff. And Macrone says, guess what? One of the inks has titanium oxide in it, sometimes known as anastase. And that was an ink, or a chemical formulation for ink, that was developed for the first time in 1920. This didn't compute, right? How could that possibly be? Well, the apologists for the map worked very hard to say, well, it could be that an early form of anastase could have been part, although it was not quite the same. And they got into discussions of the globular shape of the molecules and what have you. Well, to make a long story short, the Smithsonian got involved. And these are the proceedings of the Vinland Conference at the Smithsonian. Still a great dispute. Finally, however, still more chemical analyses were done. The parchment was studied. Parchment had a peculiar chemical constitution of its own. And the bottom line is that the chief curator of the Bonneke Rare Book Library at Yale University has confessed or stated it's clearly a forgery. So, which was a shame because what a wonderful story. And it is true, by the way, that the Norse, the Vikings did get to a tiny little sliver of North America in Newfoundland, and there is a World Heritage Site called Lance au Meadow, and you can visit it, and there are the remains of an early Viking settlement there. So I think it's been established that yes, in some fashion, the Vikings did beat Christopher Columbus.
But not using that map.
Not using that map. That is true. That is true. Okay, so somewhere I've got some more notes. I'm going to suggest at this point that we can perhaps, let's go back and turn off the lights because we've got some more things that we can look at in the dark. Okay.
Is it
pointer?
on your
There it is.
jacket?
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
So here we are, we're back with Heinrich Scherer and his drawers and the California island. I guess maybe before I had asked for the lights to turn off, I should have done a little show and tell about projections. How is it actually that a map maker deals with the two realities, which are that the Earth is spherical. Most maps are two-dimensional. How do you render them in some sort of accurate way? And look at it. If this is the Earth, and if you try to simply take a flat plane and then drop lines down from the center or from the center out, so they would project onto the flat plane, you'd get an image, but it would be increasingly distorted the further away that you got from the point of contact. So a flat plane is not a very good way to render the Earth. So there must be better ways. Well, one of the better ways was developed by the famous Gerard Mercator, and his conception was, we'll take a cylinder and put it around the Earth, and again, draw lines from the very center of Earth right through the surface of the planet until they hit the paper, and make your mark there. And the result of doing that is a projection that we're all familiar with when we were kids, the Mercator projection. It would be up on our school bulletin boards, and what it always showed was the further north you got, the bigger things got. The further south you got, the bigger things got. So it turned out that Greenland, for example, was as big as Africa, even though in the real world, Africa is 14 times bigger than Greenland. There was a great virtue of this projection, however, and that is for mariners. If you have a Mercator map and you set a course and you say, my course is going to be 060, about 60 degrees to the east of north, and that's going to take you, according to Mercator's projection, to an objective. It's going to get you there. You don't have to change course at all. You just follow stay on 060060060 and you'll get there. Now, it's not necessarily the fastest way to get there. Great circle routes are better. But Mercator's projection was a great friend to the navigator. Now, there were other projections that people use, conical projections. And if you take a cone like this, and you curve it around like so, which the modern invention of Velcro enables.
You want the lights on?
Well, can people see?
I can turn them on.
Okay. If you do the same exercise, you start at the center of the Earth, you draw your lines right through the surface until they hit the cone. What are you left with? You're left with a map that looks something like this. And in truth, it's almost like that map that we were looking at that Lorenz Fries did using the Ptolemaic points. It's an improvement, but it's not perfect. So over time, people thought about what could you do to make it even better. And of course, globe makers had already figured this out. And the idea was to do what Heinrich Scherer did, print on each one of these on a kind of a rounded, pointed gore. I'm not doing a very good job here, but with 12 or 15 of these, you could create something that was much more accurate than before. And globe makers, of course, were the ones who really figured this out. All right, so that's just a little bit about projection, but it bedeviled map makers throughout history. And for modern students, there are all sorts of highly sophisticated projections that do an even better job. But at the end of the day, the distortions inherent in moving from the sphere to the plane can't be completely gotten rid of. All right, that's my little show and tell for the day. I think it's maybe time to go back with the lights off again.
John, I have a question.
Yeah.
When did they start to realize that the Earth was not a sphere, but an oblate spheroid?
Well, that's a good question, and maybe I think actually the Greeks were not unaware of the imperfections. I mean, Aristotle loved the perfection of the sphere, but by the time of Ptolemy and others, I think they had a general recognition that it wasn't perfect. Now, when they began to actually calculate how much greater the circumference of the Earth is at the equator than it is if you went over the poles, for example, I don't know, Justin. Good question. I'll try to do some homework. Okay, but let's proceed here. Okay. Jane, do you want to say a few words about cartouches?
So, I think one of the most charming things about a lot of old maps, especially the Dutch and the German ones, are the decorations that surround the title, and this is spectacular. So this one's showing New Belgium, and you've got all of the natives and the trade goods that are being illustrated, so what you get in New England and what the Europeans found in New England. I'm sure is this New York? Is this
That's New York, that's New Amsterdam.
Yeah, so, anyway, the title cartouche is sort of the star, but there are often multiple cartouches on maps, some that show the scale, or that show if there are different colors used for different borders. So maybe like a map of the West Indies, they would show British colonies and Dutch colonies and Spanish possessions with different colors, and that would be in another cartouche often. And so it's and then well, this one's just spectacular because you've got critters and you've got forts, and, but the amazing decoration of that sort of almost allegorizes the physical location that the map is representing. So lots of maps of the New World are going to have natives. Lots of maps of Africa have natives. And then you've got, of course, the Europeans looking like they're virtuous, but well, we don't know. They probably abuse their privilege. So they serve a lot of different purposes. And and this one, can I talk about the compass rose? This is one of the things that tickles me. This is the compass rose, which points north. North wasn't always at the top, but like John has a fabulous map where north is right. It wasn't a convention really until sometime in the 18th century. Yeah. But the compass rose shows all these wonderful lines, and those would be used by navigators, and those are called rum lines. And it's not like rum. It's R-H-U-M-B. So, did I leave some?
No, I think that's good. Could we just do a brief lights on, because Jane has a wonderful graphic to show what the anatomy of a typical large map, antique map looks like.
I have a cartouche question.
Yeah.
So is it just a coincidence that carto, as in cartography, is the first part of cartouche? And
Cartoon,
sorry?
cartoon.
It's up, well,
Cartouche, it comes from Egypt, the little things that with names that, okay, we've got more homework to do.
but to me, it's always been like a decorative title, if you, it's a decorative title
Yeah,
block.
they're decorative, but
Yeah.
it's not just the title. It's often covers other things.
Yep.
So Dave found this wonderful thing from Old World Auctions, and it left out rum lines, so I had to point them out. But so I mean, there are things like margin. We all know margin, right? But the idea there's one title here, and then there's the alternate title, and a cartouche with a legend, and then you've got an escutcheon, and the plate mark is the physical line that you can see in the paper that was made by the plate. So because the pressure of the printing press actually pushes the paper and the plate so tightly together that the ink is sucked up into the paper from the plate, and it makes the edge of the plate makes a mark. There are false plate marks on some fake maps. Sorry. We don't do that. But anyway, and this line right around the edge is called the neat line. I'm sorry, the neat. So there's right at the edge of the image. That's the neat line.
What does that mean?
I don't know. It's just what we call it.
Or is that where you frame to? In other words, you don't want to be within the neat line?
No. It's just often measurements of either a print or a map are to the neat line.
To the neat line, okay, yeah.
Sometimes the measurements will be to the plate mark if something doesn't really have, and it's more of a a vignette, so it doesn't have a line around it, so then you would measure the plate line. And, oh, here's the compass rose. See, this one was sideways too. Because that was the way I would want to look at it. But anyway, is this the same? It's almost the same map that you have, isn't it? It's the Chesapeake.
It's similar.
Yeah, it's very similar.
Yep.
So then you've got the scale cartouche here, and the signature, that's for the printer, so that he knows which page comes next. And, did I leave anything else?
So if you find a map that you're interested in, there are lots of ways of thinking about it, and Jane can help you think about it more carefully. Now, we've been going for quite a while, so what I'm going to do is to radically shorten the remainder of the presentation.
Part two.
David's got a bunch of wine here that he wants people to So, thank you, Jane.
Did somebody not see this very well? We can pass it around.
If anybody wants a copy of that, we can email it to you.
Yeah,
I mean,
we have a digital copy of that.
so I think, John, are you still on the page?
We're going to go on the second page, the back page. This is
Right.
We're going to review the history of Philadelphia in 10 minutes.
So lights out? That's a lot of ground to cover.
He can do it.
All right, Philadelphia. Oh, wait a minute, this looks like London. Oh, man,
That was a test.
big screw up
That was
here.
a test.
No, it's here for a reason. If you look closely, you'll see that this isn't just a map of London. This is a map of London in 1666. Now, what happened in London? Big fire. The Great Fire of 1666. And here you see, this is an iconic figure of a Thames boatman. For those of you who spent any time in London, you know that the boatmen of the Thames are an institution. It's a very important institution. He is standing with one of his oars, sobbing at what has just happened to London. Well, one of the reasons that London's fire burned so brightly and so long was that fire apparatus had a great deal of difficulty getting to it. Again, if you've been to old London, you realize how tortuous some of the streets are, some of the corners are, and it's much better now than it was in the 1600s. But the long and short of it is that a lesson was taken from that experience by no less than William Penn. And Penn said when he had the opportunity to create his own city in the province of Pennsylvania, given to him by the king because of a debt that the king owed to his father. He employed a guy named Thomas Holme to lay out the plan for his new green country town. And as you will see, the Holme plan is a beauty of rectangular simplicity. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares. They are pretty much where they are today. Washington Square, Franklin Square. Logan has become a circle, and Rittenhouse Square here. And in the center, where City Hall is now, there were various things, including once upon a time a water tower. But the long and short of it is, this was the contemplation of what Philadelphia would look like. And it's thought by many to be the very first time that a big city was seriously planned for in advance. Now, we're just going to take a quick travel through various portrayals of Philadelphia. This is a picture of what sits behind me. As you can see, it's mostly a map of the sea and the configuration of the land. There's only one man-made item in it, and it's right here, a little tiny red square. That's Philadelphia in 1689. Again, it didn't exist except in the minds of Thomas Home and William Penn. Now we're going to go forward to 1777. We're in the midst of the Revolutionary War. This is what Matthew Lotter came up with. He portrays the whole grid. In all honesty, it hadn't been filled out yet. But there's a wonderful picture of the State House, which we think of now as Independence Hall. And this is one of the classic maps of Philadelphia from the late 1700s. Now we're going to jump forward only 2 years. Now we have a totally different conception of Philadelphia, where what has happened? Well, the Brits have kicked the Americans out. So this is British occupation, and the map maker in this case, Faden, portrays only what is really in existence. That's really what all Philadelphia amounted to at that point. There were 10 defensive posts along the top. Washington and the Americans were upstream in Valley Forge, but the Brits were not taking any chances. They built this protective wall. There was another one here, and there was another one to the south. So this is British occupation. One small interesting thing that we're going to kind of take note of it a little bit later is, what is this thing? It doesn't exist anymore. No, it's not Hog Island. It's Windmill Island. There is a Hog Island, of course, but this is Windmill Island. And let's keep going forward. This is one of the famous prints of the way Philadelphia looked in roughly 1790 or so. And the war is over. Philadelphia is a bustling port. Look at all the traffic. Look at all the traffic here. Christ Church is the tall steeple in the middle. There are docks after docks after docks. Dock Street comes down here. High Street here. Vine Street's over here. And guess what? There's a windmill on an island in the middle of the Delaware. Has anybody seen Windmill Island? No. I haven't. So let's jump ahead. Now we're in 1850, and this is a beautiful print of Philadelphia as it stood in the year 1850 by John Bachman. And now you can see Philadelphia has stretched all the way across to the Schuylkill. It is bustling. High Street, which is now Market Street, is a major zone of commercial activity. Steam-powered vessels have started to appear on the Schuylkill. There's Windmill Island. I'll be darned, it's still there. This is the Delaware, right?
Okay.
Schuylkill is way back there.
Okay.
And this funny-looking thing is a water tower. This Fairmount, now the scene of the Philadelphia Art Museum, was a huge reservoir. And that's the way it looked in 1850.
John, would ballooning have influenced some of these aerial imaginations?
You know, Justin, I'm so glad you mentioned this, because the real title of this map is A Bird's Eye View of Philadelphia. And this came into vogue at roughly the same time that hot air ballooning became very popular. And so artists learned how to draw, and they also began to imagine it. They didn't have to actually be up in the basket. But the whole notion, and thank you for saying so, Justin, the whole notion of mankind being able to get up off the earth, take a look down, began to revolutionize the way maps were portrayed. Now we're going to go forward to 26 more years, and this is when, of course, the nation was celebrating the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. Philadelphia was ground zero for that, and some of the magnificent buildings really weird, some of them, are portrayed here. This map, portrayed by Augustus Mitchell and sold by a guy named Wade to people visiting Philadelphia during the centennial, had images of all these buildings. And here is Memorial Hall, the only one that still exists. And then lastly, we're just going to finish with a very simple map produced by the city of Philadelphia itself. This is Philadelphia having filled in by the late 1800s. What used to be a waterway is now Dock Street. You can see Independence Square here, Washington Square here, all these wonderful rectangular lines. Philadelphia was living up to the home plan. And look at all these piers. Philadelphia in that day and age was still the most principal port in the United States. So anyway, I'm going to end there, but I wanted to give you at least a quick run for 200 years through Philadelphia's history. And I want to thank you for coming and for being patient and listening to what we have to say.
I have one question. In our talks about preparing for this in the last week or so, and I think we were talking about, in context, the Great Fire in London, but didn't that have something to do with William Penn's request for the way that the Philadelphia would be laid out, so they wouldn't have the same, I don't know, 90-degree turns, or did we talk about something like?
He certainly wanted to make sure that access by fire companies, all of which were volunteer, and Philadelphia has a wonderful history of volunteer fire companies, that fire companies could get to the scene. And of course the buildings have now filled in.
Right.
And so you here have a great deal of complexity that didn't exist before, and alleys that were probably very difficult to cut up.
But did that influence the way the town was laid out?
Absolutely. It was a fundamental premise.
I mean, in other words, more circles than angles, or
More squares than anything else.
more squares?
Yeah, no
Wider
squiggly lines.
streets.
Right, okay.
The
Yeah,
grid
no-
has.
No
Hence
lanes.
the squares, in other words, that we all know. Okay.
All right. If you have any other questions, I'd be happy to chat with you. I think David has some refreshments back there.
We still have some refreshments back here. Again, thanks for coming out. Justin will take your question. I just wanted to say, John and I have talked about continuing this series sometime in the summer or fall, perhaps with another speaker or two. But if you're interested in that, ongoing series, let us know today, Jane, or shoot us an email and let us know. And then when we have other events like this, and we'll put you on top of the list.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right? Thank you.